We are with Lakshmi Kumar, Policy Director of Global Financial Integrity. Global Financial Integrity has just released a new recent study, Sudan in Trade Integrity. Sudan is a very symbolic country, home for many years to many famous terrorists like Osama bin Laden, and also to many terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, and now is a new hub for capital gun traffic. But it's also a country that is facing very important political changes. What kind of picture did you take of Sudan now through your report? I mean, you focus on the last 7 years, if I'm not wrong.
No, absolutely. And I think, what we wanted to emphasize is that there is a clear path for a hopeful future, because I think the leadership at the helm in the person of Mr. Abdullah Hamdok comes from a very long and storied career of reform and good governance. But, I think our concern is that there are sort of significant institutional weaknesses that come from the past. And
yeah, just to remind that only last year, the former president, Omar al-Bashir, who currently stands accused of crime against humanity, was deposed by the Sudanese military. So it's really a new time, new age for the country.
Yeah, in so many ways, this is a new path. And, this is coming also after numerous sanctions have been lifted. The US had economic sanctions for years on Sudan. And so now the only sanctions left on Sudan are UN sanctions. And, it's been still designated as a state sponsor of terrorism by the US government. However, I should preface and emphasize that does not impose economic sanctions directly on Sudan, but there is the issue of sort of its perception as an unsafe business environment, an unsafe investment destination, which, affects the quality of investment and sort of the integrity of investors that are coming into the country. So for us, when we were doing our research, that's something we saw. There were certain red flags where for instance, there was a particular Russian company that was investing within Sudan, and the company had no record of ever having worked on necessarily gold, and they gave estimates of saying Sudan has this many gold resources. But when the Sudanese government looked into it, they said there is no way Sudan has that much resources available. So what it exposed was also not just that there might be people who don't have the best companies that don't have the best governance practices, but more importantly, that Sudan had to build skills within the government to be able to assess its own resources, so that they are in a much stronger position when dealing with outside individuals coming to invest in their country. They're not dependent on them to do a lot of the technical work. They are able to do technical work around their own natural resources.
Did you focus on your report on gold and oil? We're going to talk about this in our conversation. In your opinion, I mean, just to say that Sudan became the 12th largest producer of gold in the world, exporting, if I'm not wrong, 90 tons of gold in 2018. And the private companies are allowed to deal in the sector with the condition that they sell 30% of the gold to the central bank. That's correct? Yeah.
That's changed a little bit now. So in the beginning of this year, in 2020, they sort of modified that. So now you can sell 70%, but 30% still has to go to the government. And this is only for sort of, small scale miners. It doesn't necessarily apply to sort of a lot of the larger corporations that do this.
So my question now is, as you know, as you told us, smuggling was a problem for many years, gold smuggling. And in your report, you highlighted many recommendations. So tell us, what was the problem and what the government must do to resolve the problem and to allow the country to be a new Sudan?
Thank you. No, I think the first thing we would emphasize is to knowing the identity of who is investing in these natural resources, which locations are these companies coming from, who owns them. Because when we were doing our research, and you can see that we have a full map of, the companies investing, what is the shareholding. That is, information is not readily available. That spent was a lot of time digging through company news reports, foreign language websites, to piece together that information. And in some cases, we do not know who owns the company that is investing in the resources in the country. And to me, that's a huge red flag, because that means that the individuals behind the operation of a business could be tied to sort of could be tied to could be corrupt actors, could be armed groups, could be sort of influences within the government that may or may not be benefiting from the resources. Because as far as money laundering goes, you want to make sure you know the identity of who is controlling things in order to that is a measure of transparency and accountability. And that was a huge problem.
So first we need to track, we need to map what belongs to whom.
Yes, because there are all these people investing, and there is the people that own like companies that are extracting gold. A lot of the time you don't know who's owning them. But apart from that, in order to process gold, whether it's to provide equipment, it is help to transport gold, there are a whole series of smaller actors that are involved. And there's very little information known about who are these actors. Are they sort of are those contracts directly held by people in the government? Are they connected to sort of other sorts of networks that should not be benefiting from this process and could be illegally using the money obtained from this process to sort of make Sudan lose revenues? And I think there's a clear measure of transparency and accountability.
What about the borders, the lack of border control?
So I don't think that's a solution that's going to be remedied anytime soon, easily within the next 10 years. And I think a lot of it is, is the very nature of how these countries operate, is that borders are porous and free moving. So, when we suggest recommendations, I often approach it from the perspective that no government has unlimited resources. Even the wealthiest governments in the world do not have and this is especially true of a developing country that is coming out of years of sort of conflict into a new path. So I think focusing your limited resources in areas of vulnerability that have the greatest impact makes the most sense. And while the borders are an issue, I think ensuring controls elsewhere from sort of the government down has a clearer chance and a better chance of sort of impact.
What about informal mining? What do you suggest for the country, and what the situation?
So, informal mining there's a huge issue of it being subsistence mining, because a lot of people's livelihoods are important. Now, this is twofold, in some cases, groups where the land has belonged culturally to a certain tribe for generations has had sort of, nefarious actors come in and take over the land. And so, the community loses livelihood. In other cases, the use of mercury, which is a huge issue with informal mining, has poisoned the land. So we are seeing issues of, child labor, child trafficking, sort of huge environmental impacts. And you will see a lot of sort of and when you talk about informal mining in Sudan, it has also generated a lot of conflicts with tribes warring against each other for control of mining resources. And in some cases, communities have tried to sort of extract gold on land that has been awarded to a corporation. So within Sudan, there's this huge issue of trying to balance the rights of the people that have traditionally owned the land versus the rights of, trying to encourage industrial mining. Because, if you don't address both, that's what creates conflict. That's what creates criminal economies. And so, there's a clear need to sort of balance the two interests, because not doing it is what is generating a clear trajectory of conflict within the country.
Do you also need that for gold mining, we need more enforcement control, or?
I mean, without a question, there's always the need of enforcement and control. But what happens, and very often, is that a lot of the mining regions are so far away that it's hard to physically go and inspect it for the government. And I think what might be easier is better licensing procedures, better procedures around land governance, so making the community involved as a part of it, making sure that a portion of their profits adequately goes to them. I think
So
those
more
are sort of
control at the
measures.
beginning of the process,
Absolutely,
not at the end.
absolutely,
Yeah, that's correct.
absolutely.
Yeah.
You can't, because you don't want to sort of go in and kick people out, because then there's anger and resentment, because you are depriving them of a livelihood without providing them an alternate source, and that's a real issue in a lot of these places. So finding better ways to target and have an inclusive approach, especially around informal mining, I think would go a long way to, because it's not just a law enforcement criminal issue, it's also a livelihood issue for people, and you have to balance the two.
Until now, in your opinion, how much money the country lose because of the gold smuggling?
So, it is hard for us to accurately tell how much money, because and I only say this because the calculations we use are value gaps. So we look at, how much Sudan is exporting versus how much the neighboring country, how much an importing country says they are importing the gold. So the value gap represents a possible range of losses. It could be as high as what we've mentioned, like 90% in what we've mentioned, but it could be lower. So, what that represents, as you can see from our report, is the total range of values that Sudan could be
But
possibly losing.
they lose.
Yes, but what is without question is they are losing revenues in the millions of dollars.
Let's talk now about oil, because in a certain way there is a relationship between gold and oil, in the sense that before the independence of South Sudan, oil was much more relevant for the national economy, isn't it? But at the same time, even after the South Sudan independence, oil is still relevant. Can you explain us why?
So in many ways and this is an interesting that people it's interesting is because, and it goes back to Sudan's history, because even though all the oil fields are in the south of Sudan, the infrastructure to pump the oil, move the oil, export the oil is located entirely in what in those days would be described as the north of Sudan, but what you and I would now describe as just Sudan. And so the survival of the South Sudanese oil industry is dependent on Sudan. And similarly, Sudan is very much dependent on South Sudan. So it is a very mutually beneficial relationship. However, it's a relationship that has gone into a lot of conflict as well. And so, in some cases, oil production has stopped. South Sudan has refused to pump oil to Sudan, even at the detriment of the own country's economies. But and at this point, South Sudan, as part of their independence agreement, is sending a share of their profits to Sudan as well. So we do see a lot of oil, therefore, that is exported from Sudan. But as you can tell from our report, there's a value gap of over 84% in terms of what they have declared as exports versus what other countries are declaring as imports. And this goes back to a longer history in Sudan, where the government has had issues in terms of accurate reporting of data. This is something we saw even with gold. We looked at two government presentations from about 4 years apart, and we saw that there was when the government originally did the presentation, they reported the country was pursuing a certain amount of gold. 4 years later, they said that there was almost a 40-ton difference in what the government reported. And this is affecting how we do reports, because organizations such as myself and others that worked on this issue, if you look at the numbers that we've all crunched, depending on when the organization did the analysis, the value gap is different. And all of us based our research on the government report. So in some cases, we were able to say, hey, the natural resource makes up 20% of your exports. If you do it another year, it says the natural resource makes 6% of your exports, and all of it's based on government data.
But do you think that there is also lack of transparency, conflict of interest, and how they affect the evolution, the development of the country?
No, absolutely. I think that's something that we always push for, is transparency and accountability at every level. And at the crux of it is the need as I said, to understand the individual who is behind operations. And so we call it the natural person. But on the government's end of things is to also make sure that because when you're talking about natural resource governance, whether it's oil and gold, there's a commercial component for the government. There's also the responsibility of oversight. In Sudan, the entities that are responsible for the commercial element and the entities that are responsible for regulating and supervision are the same. So how are you going to regulate the person that's giving you money if your interests are tied together? And so I think separation of those powers at the head, at the very top level, at the ministry is important, whether it's the Ministry of Oil or the Ministry of Minerals. It has to be separated. In Sudan's case, Sudapet, which was sort of the commercial arm, the government dissolved it in 2019. And so, and then the ministry absorbed all the powers of what was the commercial arm. And so we have tried to find evidence that another type of entity has been set up to handle commercial operations, but that's not the case. And so, historically, it has always presented a high risk when the commercial interests and the supervisory interests of the government are one and the same, because you cannot supervise someone who when your own income is dependent on that supervision, you will not police that person well. So there's a huge conflict of interest.
Just to sum up and just summing up your recommendation to really fight money laundering in Sudan, what is the most important recommendation that you suggest? What is the weakest part of a chain that you can focus?
The weakest part of the chain, I would say, is the absence of clear lack of beneficial ownership norms and clear procedures on how to award concessions. To just give you one example, the Sudanese government in one day awarded signed agreements with 50 companies. They signed 50 agreements to extract minerals in one day. How do you have the resources to vet 50 different agreements and sign it in one day? That speaks to sort of, lack of clear-cut procedures within the government. So I would say, on the government side, having transparent and robust procedures. On the side of investors, making sure you know who is investing in your country, so having beneficial ownership norms.
Just to finish our interview, if the country won't follow your recommendation, what are the risks in terms of terrorism, of organized crime? I mean, it's a strategical hub.
And I think we often, I think to answer this, it's to understand what goes back to the root causes of conflict. And very often the root causes of conflict comes from, state fragility, from the absence of, an economic livelihood. So you see a lot of people that are impoverished, who sort of are disenfranchised going into it because of, reasons sometimes tied to sort of sheer economic deprivation. And so I think that's what the government should look, is that, they've had I think one of the longest recorded civil wars in the world. And if the path forward is to sort of, and you're right now at a tipping point where it could go either way. So in order to sort of, ensure that there's a clearer and stronger path forward, I think, having a commitment to this demonstrable commitment is important. But in a more practical level, in order for Sudan to sort of, get World Bank loans, they need the US support, and the US cannot give that support till the country is off the state sponsor of terrorism list. And so there is a clear financial interest for them, for not just the economic, but especially for the economic development, to be able to show that they are, taking adequate measures towards this.
Yeah, there was a first step last May when Sudan was excluded for the first time since 1993 from the list of uncooperative countries, but is still, as you said, the list of states sponsoring terrorism. So that's the point. I really thank you so much, Lakshmi, for being here. See you next time.
Thank you so much, Maria. It's a pleasure to talk to you, and always looking forward to the next chat.
Thank you.